This week we're talking about social judgment theory. I happen to really like social judgment theory. It is not a theory that I've actually used in research, though the principles of it do really inform much of my thinking about persuasion. So the main idea here of social judgment theory that I'll be coming back to at some different points in this lecture is the idea that people are persuaded when you're able to build some sort of common ground with them. In many ways, that's the premise of this theory. You're not going to see that at first, but write that down and keep that in mind as we're talking about this, that social judgment theory is very much about the idea that you persuade someone when you begin by showing that you have common ground. By common ground, I mean that you see things in ways that are similar to them or that you can validate their position and where they are. So you have some common ground. You might call it mutual respect, but it's really more about mutual understanding, some common ground. This is the first part of the lecture, and here I'm dealing with some main concepts. This is perhaps the denser half of it. I've broken out just into the concepts and main principles, and then we're going to work through it a little bit more in the second half of the lecture. So social judgment theory, you've actually come across one of the main principles of social judgment theory before. In the very first lecture, I talked about Shreve, Shreve, and Nebergall. And if you recall, I said there that persuasion is a process, or they see persuasion as a process, right? And by that, I didn't mean that to persuade somebody there's step one, step two, step three. Instead, it was the idea that we don't always persuade somebody from being against something to for something. We persuade them to be from totally against something to less against it, to more open to it, to slightly favorable for it, to more favorable for something, right? That's what that process is. You might recall I gave the silly example about coffee in that first lecture, but that was the idea that persuasion is a process. Because often we think of persuasion where we want to put people in a room and then we want to give them a persuasive message and then ask them, do you agree with me, yes or no? Right? Which is a bit like when you were in fifth grade and you passed a note to somebody and you said, do you like me, yes or no? And it may have been hard sometimes if you were the one receiving that paper, especially for the person seated next to me, perhaps, I don't know. And you're thinking, do I like you? I mean, maybe, or really, sort of? Right? And so persuasion as a process is the idea that it's not that you're necessarily for something or against something, but you can have these areas of gray in between totally for and totally against, where you're sort of for it or sort of not comfortable with it, so kind of against it, right? You're in that sort of place. So we might look at it this way, right? A continuum, and we talked about this before in that first lecture, that persuasion occurring along a continuum, and that for any issue, there are various positions, and people are strongly for a general idea or strongly against a general idea. So let's take a minute to use the example of bans on tobacco products. We currently do have bans on tobacco products. Uh, at the very least, you cannot smoke in a federal building. At ETSU, you cannot smoke in the buildings, and then they changed the policy, you cannot smoke on campus or actually use tobacco products on campus, where those are tobacco bans. And now we have bans, you can't smoke in restaurants, only in bars, and bars defined in very specific ways of what constitutes being a bar. So when we talk about tobacco bans, there's positions that are strongly for and strongly against. So someone who is strongly for changing this is strongly for changing all tobacco bans, right? At the one end, it's end all tobacco bans. Someone wants to change the laws regarding tobacco bans, right? And therefore, ending all tobacco bans. As far as they're concerned, you should be able to smoke in the middle of a kindergarten classroom. And maybe, I don't know, I've never really smoked, but maybe if you're teaching kindergarten, having a smoke's not a bad thing. Maybe you need one. But anyway, the idea of ending all tobacco bans. You can smoke wherever you want to. And because, by the way, faculty like 20 plus years ago used to smoke in the classrooms at ETSU. Okay, anyway, so that's ending all tobacco bans, right? But then less stringent is someone who says, well, let's just end the tobacco bans in bars. You can have them like in federal buildings or in schools or whatever, but not, but don't, but end tobacco bans in bars. You can smoke in bars in Tennessee, but in other states, you cannot smoke in bars, right? So you'd end tobacco bans are in bars. You would allow tobacco to be used in restaurants, which has been banned in Tennessee. Then this middle position is you just leave things as they are. Whatever we got now is fine, leave it alone. And then you get Well, instead, let's just heavily tax all tobacco, right? We'll do that. We should fine people for whenever they smoke in public, and then we should straight up outlaw tobacco, right? You see that at one end, right? If I do a little bit of drawing here, right? At one end up here, very extreme, right? Ending all tobacco bans, right? So you can smoke whenever you like. And we get another extreme right down here, right? Outlawing all tobacco bans. The top one's in red, the bottom one's in green. If you cannot see that, I apologize, but I'm just marking out where those two are, right? So ending all tobacco bans versus outlawing all tobacco, those are two, right, extreme positions. And the idea is that you probably aren't at one extreme or the other. You're probably, I don't know, you're maybe somewhere in the middle, right? Or you're here, right? But the idea is that people are not always here up at these ends, right? They're not always at the ends. They're often somewhere more in the middle. At the risk of belaboring an idea you already understand, I want to work through one more example and spend a little bit more time with it. I'm going to use the example of animal rights, and I really have much of a stake in here. I'm not telling you what you should or shouldn't do or shaming anybody. I'm just using this as an example. So at one end on this continuum, at the very top here, we have a position that's very much for animal rights and protection. That's strict vegetarianism, that you would never kill an animal just so you can eat it, right? That even for eating an animal, that's not okay, right? That's at one end. And you see slightly less strict is the one right below that that says, well, you can eat an animal if it's a, if you will, lower level animal. This is the idea that my dog is smart, so I won't eat my dog, but a chicken is dumb, so I don't mind eating it, right? So that's eating lower level animals. Or also even in the animals that you see in your supermarket. Some people, for instance, find are okay eating cows, right, eating beef, but not pork, right, which is or pigs, right, because they believe that pigs actually are fairly smart, and so they don't want to eat pigs because they just feel they are too smart, and so therefore they don't want to eat them. So they're okay eating lower level animals like a cow, but not a pig because pigs are smarter, supposedly. Okay. All right. Then we get the position of no fur, right? And this is the idea. And as you'll see, for instance, that what I'm talking about is that people who are, just we look at the no fur example for a moment. You get people who may not be vegetarians, and they may be okay eating both pigs and cows. They don't really distinguish lower and higher level animals, but they won't be. But they're not going to be okay with fur, right? So it's a less strict position. You see, I'm saying that each one of these are people have their sense of what's not okay is sort of broader and broader, because strict vegetarianism is a pretty narrow position. No fur is a much broader position, right? Just like not wearing leather, right? Not wearing leather, or not wearing, excuse me, leather being okay. That people who feel like they don't like the idea of fur in which an animal's killed just for its skin, like mink coats. The mink is an animal, it's killed pretty much just for its fur, and then the rest of it's discarded. So it lives and dies for the sake of its fur. As opposed to like leather, some people are okay with leather, really thinking of cowhide here, because they feel like since the rest of it was made into a burger and steaks and whatnot, they feel okay with the leftover being used for leather, right? So you see where this is a less strict position in terms of animal rights. Even less strict still as we go down one to supporting factory farming. Factory farming just means that, for instance, the chickens, as opposed to running free in the field and then you take them inside and butcher them, they live in little cages and then you butcher them. That's factory farming in a very small nutshell. It's not just nutshell, my friends, a small nutshell. Okay. A even less sort of strict animal rights position, this idea of allowing sport hunting. That is to say, killing an animal not because you need its meat, but because you want the prize of it, right? You want its antlers, its head, its skin. You just want to say how many birds you shot out of the sky, etc. Right? Sport hunting can also be fish as well, right? It's the idea of that sport hunting. And this is not a judgment against people who fish and hunt. I've just used this as an example of that's so much further away from vegetarianism. And then the final position here at a real extreme, right? This is very much an extreme, is treating animals as property. And by that I mean that because an animal is property, I can do whatever I want with it. It is in fact illegal to abuse an animal, right? If you, I won't tell stories, it's just too horrific, but to hurt an animal for the fun of it, just as an amusement, like say a dog or a cat on the street, that's illegal. But if we decide that animals are merely property, then we can do whatever we want with them. And that's a position that's way far away from the notions of strict vegetarianism. Okay. So as you look at this, you probably see different places where you sort of support that idea, but not others. And let's just give an example here that you don't believe in fur. You think that raising an animal and killing it just for its fur, you just can't get behind that, right? You really can't get behind that. And an example of this is the Stoot. See it? Actually, this is a young one. That's important. It's young because see, it's white and then it has that little black tail. Isn't that pretty? If you've ever heard of ermine, which is what the coats of royalty used to be edged with, or even their crowns were edged with ermine, which was that white fur with looks like little black diamonds. That was actually the fur from the tail of the little baby Stoot, right? And you're like, listen, look at that thing. It's so cute. I could never, right? So you're totally on board with no fur. So put that there in that first box, which is yellow, if you can see that, right? And then these other positions, though, right? You like strict vegetarianism. You just can't get into strict vegetarianism. I mean, you drive by McDonald's, you're always thinking, I could do that. I mean, I realize they have salads, but you're thinking, yeah, I could, like, if you're like me, it's true. I can't be a strict vegetarianism, or I guess I could, I suppose, but my gosh, I could probably eat a hamburger every day of the week. I'm sorry, it is who I am, or who I choose to be, I suppose. And at the other end, you might be somebody who says, and these are really not my own positions, I'm just giving as examples, that you also you don't like the idea of killing animals just for the fun of it, right? Which is sport hunting, right down here. That's sport hunting, and also treating animals as property. You just can't get behind that. So we've established then, right? We've established that there's one thing you feel very strongly about up here, right? That's that no fur, and you're very strongly for it, and you're very strongly against the idea of strict vegetarianism. You just aren't going to do that. And the idea of sport hunting and animals as property, you're just not behind that. But we have three other positions. So how do you feel about that? Well, you might be on the fence about them. So you might think, gosh, is it really okay that I am eating, the animals like again, a good friend of mine who won't eat pork, not for any religious issue or a reason, but she just feels that they actually are smarter than we give them credit for. And there is some research behind that. And also people who say, gosh, I mean, I'm not for fur. How can I be okay with leather? I don't know. I'm sort of torn. And factory farming, does it matter if they run free before they're killed or not? I don't know, right? So you get then, right, this very clear, I say right up here, right, these absolutely knots up here at the top and at the bottom. In the middle, you're absolutely for, it's a star, you're absolutely for it, but you're not sure about the other places. This is a very common thing that people experience. So all of these positions of I love it, I hate it, right, and I'm not sure are latitudes. And the first latitude is latitude of acceptance. Your book talks about these, right? So LOA is the abbreviation for latitude of acceptance. And those are the things that when you saw them, I marked them on the previous slide there in yellow, that you thought, yeah, I mean, that's real. I firmly believe in that. That is a position I do agree with. And then you get these latitudes of rejection, and you think, oh no, 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 oh no, no, I just can't do that, right? Strict vegetarianism or animals as property, those two ends, you're like, yeah, no, 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 that's not me. And there's those places in the middle, those latitudes of non-commitment, where you're just like, well, I mean, is it okay if I say no to fur? Is leather really okay then? I don't know. I am not committed. You see where the name comes from, right? So think about that, right? Acceptance is yellow, red is rejection, purple is non-commitment, if you can see the difference of the red and purple. If not, I apologize for that selection. If we look back at the example for a moment, you see again how those colors were used, right? So that latitude of acceptance is right there in the middle at no fur, or sort of the middle there at no fur. Those on the next to it are non-commitment, and the ends there are rejection. And typically, which is not always, this is about how we end up seeing people's latitudes. Just the idea that there is often an acceptance in the middle. It's typically bounded, which is to say bordered by, or bordered, I guess the other word, bordered by non-commitment, and then at the edges are extremes, right? Which makes sense. So a person's sort of like, if you let me draw a little line here, right? So we're going to start out in this spot, and you're like, yes, absolutely, maybe, no, right? So as we move along, right, we get less certain. We go, or we get we move from a certainty about yes to an uncertainty to an absolute no, right? I hope that makes sense. One of the important things to understand people's latitudes and which latitude they're going to take is their anchor. So again, this is another concept. Just hold on to this for a moment. It's going to be okay, right? So anchors are really a person's central position. Their central position on an issue, like the no fur. That would be where your anchor is there on that no fur. It's the center, right? The central position, the center of your latitudes. This is based on your values, your attitudes, and your beliefs. That's what informs this. Values, attitudes, and beliefs, again, just about, in this case of animals, about the relationship between animals and humans, our place in the universe, what, you know, do we, what is the need of one versus the other, all sorts of issues of ethics and, say, as I say, values, attitudes, and beliefs. That's what establishes that central position, which is where your anchor is, right? Your anchor. And we have this issue of ego involvement. I'll talk about that arrow at the end there, at the end of that in a second here. But ego involvement is just how important is this issue to you, right? How important is it to you? Because there are some issues when you ask people about them, they say, yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't like that. I mean, I don't really care if anything changes. I don't really like it, but it doesn't mean a whole lot to me. Versus other issues where you think, no, this affects me tremendously. I have very strong feelings about it, right? So how much it affects you is your ego involvement. You see here I have this arrow up, and that's meaning as you are more ego involved. The book talks about this as well. So you should hear what I'm saying, read the book. You're getting two different versions of this, make some sense of it, right? But as your ego involvement goes up, people have bigger anchors, right? And how that affects all this, we'll talk about in our next example. But as a person's ego gets involvement is bigger, as this issue affects them more. For instance, issues about, um, we'll say, public education for K through 12. I always cared about that some, but when I had children, my ego involvement increased, and therefore my anchor got bigger, which is affecting part of my latitudes. We're going to talk about how in a moment here, right? When ego involvement goes up, your anchor gets larger, right? And where we talk about that, your anchor gets bigger. It also means you end up doing more rejection, right? Because you feel more strongly about something, your anchor getting bigger means that also you're less interested and less tolerant of other positions. So as I've become a parent, I would imagine, really, if I were to stop and think about it, my feeling about what should happen in K through 12 schools has probably changed. Again, I'm much more concerned. I have a larger anchor, and that means I'm probably less tolerant of different ideas. Whereas some things before I might have thought, oh, I don't know, maybe, maybe not. I don't really have an opinion on. Oh, I probably have more of an opinion now, and things I might have been more tolerant of, I'm now less tolerant of because I'm more ego invested. I'm going to accept fewer alternatives, right? So think about politically, when somebody's very politically committed to a certain issue, or even in terms of religion, right? Someone very, very strongly religiously committed, right? They'll reject the more committed they are, the more rejection they have of minor deviations from that political position or from that religious practice, right? So as we're more ego involved, our anchor is bigger, and that means we reject. And we're at the end of this lecture now. Very quickly here, I want to go over the terms and concepts we're going to be dealing with when we move into the next lecture. The idea is that there are three types of judgments. Those judgments are assimilation, contrast, and boomerang, right? We have judgments of assimilation, contrast, and boomerang, and I'm going to show you how those work in the next presentation. What I want to tell you right now is that that's all affected by ego. As a person that has higher ego involvement, and once more you see that arrow up, that as a person's ego goes up, right, they're going to have greater skew and greater distortion of the things they're hearing, which is going to then affect the judgments they make. I know it doesn't really make a lot of sense now, but just trust me on this. Take a note on that, and we're going to talk about how that fits in a moment, right? All this is to say, right, that if people are more ego involved, they get more, their judgments, they skew and distort the information more, and this affects their contrast and assimilation. They actually do more. They're going to have increased contrast and assimilation. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now, but if you hold on to that piece of information, we're going to talk about it in the next presentation. Thank you.